Reserve Bank has been in the news of late. Initially, stories about nationalizing the Reserve Bank, and then more recently, and perhaps more controversially, about expanding its mandate. Both of these have created either joy in some circles or great deal of concern in others. It's perhaps worthwhile trying to get to grips with the true meaning of what is implied by some of these suggestions. Let's start off by looking at the actual mandate of the Reserve Bank as determined by the Constitution, which I'm going to read out to you. From our Constitution, the primary object of the Reserve Bank is to protect the value of the currency in the interest of balanced and sustainable economic growth in the Republic. It does not say the primary object is to create growth or create employment or to reduce poverty. It says the primary object to protect the currency. But then the sentence continues, in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth. It's a well-known fact anywhere in the world. There are various requirements, prerequisites for sustained economic growth and development. One of them is having a stable fiscal, financial, and inflationary situation. So the Reserve Bank's actions to combat inflation might appear in the short term to be detrimental for things such as growth, but in the longer term, that stable inflation environment is crucial to bring about future sustained growth. Secondly, the Constitution says the Reserve Bank, in pursuit of its primary object, must perform its functions independently and without fear, favor, or prejudice. There must be regular consultation between the bank and the cabinet member responsible for national financial matters. In pursuit of its primary object, perform its functions independently and without fear, favor, or prejudice. So it's clear from the Constitution that the Reserve Bank's main task is spelled out, basically combating inflation, and secondly, that it is an autonomous institution, especially when it comes to operational independence. So, the story about nationalizing the Reserve Bank, yes, it is true that our Reserve Bank is one of fewer than 10 in the world that are actually at this stage owned by private shareholders. So it's unusual, although not unique. The suggestion, the strong suggestion, that the government should acquire ownership of the Reserve Bank was the first story that we've been dealing with for a couple of years. In a certain sense, it doesn't really matter who the owners are. Right now, with private owners, those private owners may not interfere in what the Reserve Bank does. Those private owners do not determine the mandate of the Reserve Bank. With new owners, let's say government, the same would hold true. So regardless of who owns the Reserve Bank, the constitutional mandate determines what it must do. It doesn't really matter who the owners are. So one could be perhaps less concerned about the nationalization of the Reserve Bank. What has become more worrying in the last few days has been statements by the Secretary General, for instance, of the ANC, and supported by trade union organizations, that the mandate of the Reserve Bank should be revisited. And in so doing, they are presumably saying or suggesting that the primary object of the Reserve Bank should no longer be just to protect the value of the currency, but to look beyond that at things like growth, poverty, and the like. Now, in so doing, they're probably also thinking about recent developments, recent decisions in places like the USA and Europe. In the aftermath of the Great Recession, we did indeed see in Europe, or first of all in America, then later in Europe, quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing is really, put simplistically, a modern-day version of printing money. It's where central banks liquidate some of the assets held by the banks, typically government bonds or treasury bills. So they buy them in exchange for cash, thereby injecting cash into the banking system, which presumably would then be recycled into the bigger economy, giving rise to more economic activity and all these good things happening. We have to bear in mind, however, that the context in America and Europe of a few years ago and the context of South Africa today, they're totally different. A few years ago, America and Europe were heading towards deflation, which no one likes. So it made some kind of sense to pump more liquidity into the economy to prevent negative inflation rates. In South Africa, we don't have a deflation concern. If anything, our inflation rate tends on the higher side when compared to world averages. And indeed, there's a good chance by pumping more money into the system, inflation could shoot through the roof. That is because fundamentally in South Africa, we as a nation are living beyond our means, which means the demand for credit will always tend to exceed the availability. When I say living beyond our means, this applies at all levels. We import more than we export. Government spends more than it earns. Households spend more than they earn. In short, total spending is lower than total production, which implies there's always going to be some kind of upward inflationary pressure warranting fairly high interest rates to curb those inflationary pressures. By moving away from inflation as a major principle, a major object, and by moving away from inflation targets, we run the risk of much higher inflation rates, which, by the way, would also result probably in a substantial weakening of the rand. Now, you might say that's not always a bad thing because a weaker rand makes imports more expensive and therefore we should import less. That only holds true if we're able to produce the things we wish to import. And right now, we're not really there. So, simply assuming that fiddling around with monetary policy will create sustainable growth is a fallacy. The reasons for low growth in this country are far more fundamental, far more structural. Yes, lower interest rates might create a temporary illusion of growth. It'll be very short-lived, and before long we'll have exceptionally high inflation rates. There's also this feeling that by injecting more liquidity in the system, lowering interest rates, the economy will grow and therefore create jobs. That's not guaranteed either. It's perfectly feasible to produce many more goods than before, that was to grow the economy, without using labor as a production factor. The reasons for unemployment and the solution for unemployment cannot and may not be found in our interest rate policy. In fact, as it is, capital, machinery, equipment, and the like, is becoming more appealing as a production factor compared to labor. Now, if interest rates were to drop, then capital would actually become cheaper. The cost of capital would drop, making it even more appealing. So we could even find an almost counterintuitive situation in this country where a drop in interest rates could actually result in even higher unemployment. So put it all together, the possibility of nationalizing the Reserve Bank, perhaps not all that important or influential. The possibility of changing the mandate becomes far more worrying. And as it is, the central bank, our Reserve Bank of the last number of decades, and especially the last decade or so, as a democratic institution, has stood tall and proud, whilst others perhaps suffered some kind of loss of integrity or competence. It's almost ironic that now, in the last year or so, and hopefully the years that lie ahead, some of the institutions who've lost some of their integrity might see that being restored, and the one that stood tall is now being compromised. So it's certainly, in my opinion, changing the mandate, forcing a change in the mandate, would not deliver long-term results. Perhaps short-term results, but they would be illusory and short-lived and probably result in even bigger concerns and bigger pressures later on. Imagine a situation where we do have much lower interest rates, inflation shoots up, and we'll need draconian measures then to lower the inflation rate.